Good evening. I'm conscious that my camera is slightly playing up, but I am delighted to welcome you all to today's, I say this evening because it's this evening here, today's not quite Thanksgiving lecture. I should say here in Oxford that in the spirit of the holiday season, we actually had some snow. Those of you, well, you will all, most of you will have lived in Oxford and will know how rare snow in Oxford. But we all woke up this morning to a lovely dusting of snow in our houses, in our gardens, and here in college. And as I look out of my window here, if it weren't dark, I could still see a couple of snowmen that the students had made. So this is very much in the season. Um, we're delighted that Anna Deavere Smith, who was our Eastman professor in Michaelmas term 2023, has accepted our invitation to give her lecture tonight. As you will know, Anna is just a multi-talented person who both is a playwright, is an actor, is an academic, and in her time here, she lit up so many parts of our life. I myself attended one of her wonderful master classes with student actors. And I know that she worked very closely with the English faculty, and particularly those members of the English faculty who were interested in theatre, sharing her wisdom and experience with them. Very kindly, we have invited, and she has accepted, one of those colleagues, Dr. Professor Kirsten Shepherd-Barr, who is Professor of English and Theatre Studies at St. Catherine's College, to facilitate the question and answer after Anna's lecture. I think you have seen the instructions in terms of putting your questions in the Q&A session, and I know we'll have a wonderful discussion with Anna after the lecture. So thank you so much again for joining us. I do wish you, in anticipation, a wonderful Thanksgiving with your families and friends in 10 days or so's time. And now I am very delighted to hand over to Anna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dame Helen, and thank you, Richard Norman and Kirsten Shepherd-Barr. On the road, a search for American character. Identity is a psychic sense of place. It's a way of knowing I'm not a rock or that tree. I'm this other living creature over here. And it's a way of knowing that no matter where I place myself, that I'm not necessarily what's around me. I am a part of my surroundings, and I become separate from them. And it's being able to make these differentiations clearly that gives us an identity. And what's inside our identity is everything that's ever happened to us. It's everything that's ever happened to us and our responses to it. Because we might be alone in a trance state, someplace like the desert, and we begin to feel as though we are part of the desert, which we are right at that minute, but we are not the desert. And when we go home, we take that part of the desert that the desert gave us, but we're still not the desert. We're a part of the desert. And that's an important differentiation to make, because you don't know what you're giving if you don't know what you have. And you don't know what you're taking if you don't know what's yours and what's somebody else's. That's word for word from an interview that I conducted with the playwright, the late Ntozake Shange, aka Zaki, aka Paulette Williams. I interviewed her sometime between 1988 and 1989. Williams, the author of the groundbreaking play for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough, spelled E-N-U-F, threw off her patriarchal name, Paulette, her father's name was Paul, and buried her slave name, Williams, to be known as Entezaki Shange, which means she who comes with her own things, and she who walks like a lion, Entezaki Shange. And Entezaki not only threw off her patriarchal and slave names, she stretched the borders around how colored, Negro, Black women were being portrayed on stage, television, and film, and how they represented their work as artists. There were 7 different Black women represented in For Colored Girls. She even specified that the play should be performed by Black women with different hues of Black skin. The other playwriting frontierswoman was Adrienne Kennedy. They both refused to limit their dramatis personae to the prevailing types, the desexualized bedrock mother figure, the overly sexualized strumpet, or Topsy, the naughty girl. They also brought new speech rhythms to dramatic form. If you listen carefully to the rhythms in For Colored Girls, 1976, and listen to modern spoken word poetry, you will hear its ancestry. As a full play, it hit Broadway in 1976, was written in 74 as a series of monologues. That's 50 years of an enduring rhythm. Zaki was a grandmother of spoken word. In 1973, my friend Donald Bogle published a book, Toms, Coons, Mulattoes, Mammies, and Bucks, an excellent account of the status quo when Zaki and Adrienne Kennedy broadened the canon of Black female characters in dramatic literature. Bogle, also Black, was addicted to movies as a child. He wondered why the Black actors like Hattie McDaniel, Mantan Moreland, Bill Bojangles Robinson, and others would come on screen so briefly and then disappear. He wondered why there weren't whole movies about them, which there were not at the time. He was able to see beyond the stereotypes of then called Negro people, stereotypes that were constructed by the white industry, white writers and white directors, to see the skill and the talent of the performers. So he didn't just completely disregard them as stereotypes. He saw an insulting stereotype in the character of Mammy in Gone with the Wind, but in Hattie McDaniel, the actress, he saw a very gifted actress. He heard a commanding voice, a powerful presence. He also saw the intelligence in the choices she was making emanating from her eyes. We might not like the butler image in The Little Colonel, but the sheer talent of Bill Bojangles Robinson as he tap danced up and down the stairs with Shirley Temple cannot be denied. When these troopers entered the world of Hollywood right out of vaudeville, those skilled performances were packaged in a way that did foster racist attitudes. The year 1954 marked the culminating event of a long march towards equality in the United States with the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Understandably, people up to that time and close to that time, Black people, became more and more vigilant and self-conscious about those stereotypes. So in 1953, the NAACP, for example, had Amos and Andy, a very popular television show, but full of stereotypes, taken off the air. But taking stereotypes off the air didn't kill them. In the 1970s, a renewed interest in Black artists emerged, due in part to the commercial success of Blaxploitation films. Bogle perceived that the same stereotypes came back again in different clothing, but the actors did not have the skill of those earlier technicians who came to the screen with decades of experience in vaudeville, real troopers. Stereotypes come about when we stop looking. Why we stop looking is something we each need to discern for ourselves. And when we stop looking, we erase the particularness of other human beings, and we erase how they represent themselves physically and vocally. Doesn't take a long time to come to a judgment. Perhaps that judgment process is deeply rooted in certain survival mechanisms. From Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, he writes, to use the words of Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, segregation substitutes an I-it relationship for an I thou relationship. And it ends up relegating persons to the status of things. So segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, but it is morally wrong and sinful. Isn't segregation, Dr. King asks, an existential expression of man's tragic separation, an expression of his awful estrangement? Acting as an art form and a practice could be an I-thou practice. It could be an I-thou art form. But was it in those days that Donald Bogle wrote about? Is it now? Or does the industry require that we simply perform ourselves? I hadn't planned to be an actor. The 60s were full of disruption, bloody times, violence, and beauty. As Gloria Steinem said, it took 3 murders to make Nixon president of the United States, 2 Kennedys, and a Martin Luther King. In the summer of 1967, there were more than 150 race riots in the United States. There were assassinations, Vietnam, shattered assumptions. And yet the 60s had glamour, because glamour is a mix of beauty and violence. The 60s revolution wound down like a car with a flat tire. I graduated from college in 1971. I had no answers to the essential questions, coming in particular from my parents. Why don't you get it together and go to graduate school? No answer. It's July and you still haven't found a job. No answer. And this wasn't in the time that people lived with their parents for years and years. 2 friends encouraged me to come along with them on a road trip. Parents, California, you're going to California. What are you going to do in California? No answer. My friends and I thought that some of the revolutionary sparks of the 60s may have survived on the West Coast. Vague notion. I had $80 an overnight bag, no driver's license, a promise to myself that I would not ask my parents for any more money, and no answers. Didn't take long to get inspired. The tapestry of the West Virginia hills inspired me to try and first learn about America as land. And then I landed actually in a very peculiar place, peculiar to me, the southern tip of the West, the vanished frontier, Coronado Island, off the coast of San Diego, right on the border of Mexico. Blondes, bikes, tennis, the Navy. I wondered if how I felt in Coronado, very anxious, was how white people felt in the upper reaches of Harlem and the Bronx before it became gentrified. I then went up the coast to the San Francisco area, and I started taking acting classes, a fluke, just a way to spend some extra time. Once I had found a job and could pay my rent and got a license, saved enough money to buy a car, actually took a full year. I was amazed in my first acting classes. People were changing right before my eyes. It was revolutionary. This could be a metaphor for social change. So before looking for the shards of the revolution, why not study this? This could be the metaphor for social change. But acting is an illusion. People don't really change. They just act like they're changing. It's an illusion, which is an adjustment of persona. I studied everything happening before my eyes. That summer, I studied it as if it were a science. But acting isn't a science. It's a mystery. What was the first stop on that magical mystery tour? And it was magical that summer in San Francisco. Shakespeare class with a teacher by the name of Juanita Pat Rice. For her, the language of Shakespeare required only allegiance to the words, no need to impose your inner life on the perfectly constructed words. This came as a surprise to the students in my class who had an allegiance to what was called psychological realism, the famous method taught in regular acting classes. One person might have said something like, well, our other acting teacher said that we're looking for the truth. And the truth is inside of us. There's a Hamlet in me. And I'm after the truth of the Hamlet in me. I watched Juanita carefully. She calmly returned to Hamlet, quoting, "Speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you, trippingly on the tongue." We're about to learn that Hamlet, according to Dr. Rice, was in the words and the subtle rhythms of the words. It wasn't in the interior life of my classmate who asked that question or confronted her, no matter what metaphors he could come up with about his 22 years of living in Chicago, Milwaukee, Idaho, Utah, wherever he was from. Soon, she was positing her particular theory, and her theory was that irregularity in rhythm was a sign that things had gone awry in a character's life and in their world. If the normal rhythm was iambic pentameter, da-da, 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 were to change, especially in the second beat, to da-da, if that second beat were to change, that's an indication that something's upside down for the character and in their world. Her example was Lear's language at the very end, which you all know very well. Remember when he's lost everything and his favorite child is dead? Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? Thou come no more. Never, 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 never. It's the never, never, never that she lifted up as worthy of our attention. The normal rhythm was da-da, and now we had da-da, as in never, which is called a trochea stressed syllable, followed by an unstressed one. That's how the upside downness of Lear's inner life was captured. And then I met Queen Margaret in Richard III. The big provocation for my enduring, even to this day, interest in the connection of language to identity. Our assignment: take 14 lines of Shakespeare and say them over and over again until something happens. Now you can imagine how some classmates were eyeing each other about that assignment. Ridiculous. The teacher wasn't specific enough. She wasn't explicit. What's the explicit text? The problem I would soon learn is there's nothing specific or explicit about studying acting. Everything is couched in metaphors. I did the exercise exactly as Juanita said. I said 14 lines of Queen Margaret, random. I picked 14 random, opened up my volume of Shakespeare that I'd just gotten in a thrift store. I think it was like $5 or something like that. And randomly opened it up, 14 lines, Queen Margaret, 14 lines that happened to be a curse. You remember how she described Richard. From forth the kennel of thy womb hath crept a hellhound that doth hunt us all to death, that dog that had his teeth before his eyes to worry lambs and lap their gentle blood, that excellent grand tyrant of the earth that reigns in galled eyes of weeping souls, that foul defacer of God's handiwork, thy womb let loose to chase us to our graves. And later, cancel his bond of life, dear God, I pray, that I may live and say the dog is dead. So that's what I was saying over and over again, literally over and over again, into the wee hours of the morning. With no previous study of acting, this was like the first week. It felt intuitively then, and now I know that saying the words over and over and over again isn't so ridiculous. Why shouldn't I spend 2, 3, 4, 5 hours saying 14 lines over and over? Now I know that musicians practice small parts of compositions for hours just like that. I said those 14 lines until something happened, and something happened. I saw Queen Margaret. I knew it wasn't me because she was tiny and she was sparkling. No drugs. I saw Queen Margaret in my basement apartment in San Francisco. I conjured her. I had left Baltimore in 1971 with $80 in an overnight bag and no answers. I left California for New York 5 years later with a union card, a profession, a craft, and no answer. but a question. How did Queen Margaret show up in my tiny San Francisco apartment or in my life at all? Having a question is different from having no answers. That's why the word question includes that first syllable, quest, as in quest is search. In New York, bussing tables while I looked for work as an actress, I found myself obsessed. How did I conjure Queen Margaret? I reading things about Shakespeare's language. I came to the conclusion I was not going to become a Shakespeare scholar. I met a linguist at a cocktail party. She was curious about what I did. I didn't want to say I was an actor, because when you say you're an actor, the next question is, well, what have I seen you in? And she wouldn't have seen me in anything. I had a few jobs, but nothing that she would have seen. Some little thing on the East Village. I tell her that tell her all about Queen Margaret. And I tell her about trochees and how I had a feeling that people might speak in real life in irregular rhythms if they, like Lear, had faced loss or disruption. She didn't tell me that I was crazy. She was very interested. She's a scientist, I guess. She told me I was absolutely right. And she gave me 3 questions that would guarantee that everyday people, if I asked these 3 questions, everyday people would break out into trochees. And the questions were, have you ever come close to death? Have you ever been accused of something that you did not do? Do you know the circumstances of your birth? Have you ever come close to death? Have you been accused of something that you did not do? Do you know the circumstances of your birth? I put together a workshop with 20 actors. I'd walk up to people on the streets of New York and say, I know an actor who looks like you. If you give me an hour of your time, I'll invite you to see yourself perform. If they agreed, I'd talk to them about whatever they wanted to talk about. The lifeguard at the Y, swimming lanes in Japan, a hairdresser from a fancy salon, narcissism of his clients and mirrors, the composer, Meredith Monk, bar talk, the crunch of the desert, the magic of the skies in New Mexico. I'd ask the questions that the linguist gave me, sort of 3/4 into the time. Lo and behold, the language would change and become idiosyncratic. These changes were like trochees in principle. I rented a loft in Tribeca for a rehearsal space and produced a 2-nights-only performance for a group of actors. The real people came parading in with friends, family, entourages to see themselves perform. I only played one role, Julia, who I'd met while doing temp work in a basement of J.C. Penney's Incorporated. The experiment worked. How do I know? People always want to know, how do I know the experiment worked? Because everybody was happy. That's how I know. As I left the loft, I was the last to leave, and Julia, who I had performed, and her friends waited around for me. Walking down Leonard Street in Tribeca, downtown New York, then not multi-million-dollar apartments, but old button factories and spice warehouses taken over by artists. Julia's friends were ecstatic about the evening. One of them squealed, Julia, you were the star, girl. You were the star. The light bulb went off. What if the characters become the star of my work rather than the actors? Oh. On a trip home to Baltimore, I gave a semi-report on my experiments with language and performance. I didn't expect anybody to understand what I was talking about. My mother, to her credit, had come to the very first thing I ever directed and commented thoughtfully, I think you're before your time. My father, on the other hand, who'd almost never seen me perform, didn't even come to piano recitals when I was a girl, oddly understood the language experiment completely. He reminded me of something that my grandfather had said. If you say a word often enough, it becomes you. My experience with Queen Margaret was halfway there. I did not become her, but she did, after all, come to me. I couldn't afford a whole troupe of actors to do the kind of theater that I was trying to create, a theater that would be formed around the real words, sounds, and rhythms of American people, and a vast array of them. Whether I agreed with them or not, whether they were like me or not, on the road to search for American character. And because I had no experience in the techniques required to open philanthropic purses, I decided that, well, what would I do till I could raise money? I decided I would just play all the parts as one-person shows. And still with those West Virginia hills in my mind, I was inspired to try to become America, word for word, by repeating the words I heard, intentionally chasing that which is not me. And it had a psychological reason as well. Having survived a youth in a segregated city, Baltimore, that had educated me very well to stay in my place and to keep a distance from humans of another color. This search for American character would at least intellectually close that I, thou gap. I was interested in chasing those who were different from me. Different. The it. How about closing that gap? How about coming to the I, thou? I would enjoy the land and put myself in other people's words in the same way that the metaphor goes, that we put ourselves into other people's shoes. The late Mary Ellen Mark, iconic American photographer, wrote in the preface to the exhibition catalog of American Odyssey, 1999, that the camera gave her the necessary distance to come close to strangers. And the tape recorder gave me that necessary distance to come close to strangers. I've now talked to thousands of Americans with different political points of view. And I'm going to introduce you now to two extremes in performance, back to word for word. This is word for word from my friend, a rodeo bull rider, who I shown Idaho. I asked him what it meant to be tough. Brent. Toughness? Oh, we was in West Jordan, Utah, and I had this bull shove my face right through the metal chutes. And some buddies drove me to the hospital. It took like 5 hours to sew me up. And they straighten out your nose. I had to be at a rodeo that night, so I really didn't want them to put me under anesthesia, however you say that word. And so when they straighten out your nose, I told them to do without it. And when they straighten out your nose, they take these two rods and shove them up your nose, and they work their way up, and that straightens your nose all up. And felt like they were shoving it clear through my brains. It was going to come out of the top of my head. And everybody saw it, said it should have killed me. They didn't even knock me out. Guess that'd be toughness and determination. I think I ride more out of determination. Just hang on till the whistle blows. No matter if you're riding upside down. Like determination, you're just going to ride till the back of your head hits the dirt. That photograph of Brent Williams is taken by Diana Walker. Go to the other end of the spectrum. American hero, Congressman John Lewis, who, like Dr. Martin Luther King, was dedicated to opening the boils of our society to the light. And he fought for justice, the civil rights movement. He told me what happened when he went back to Montgomery, Alabama, 52 years after he had been mercilessly beaten by police officers during a march. It's called Keep the Faith. John Lewis. On our way on this trip that we've been taking for the past 13 years. I've been going back every year since 1965, back to Selma to commemorate the anniversary of Bloody Sunday. It took place on March 7, 1965. But we usually stop in Birmingham for a day, and then we go to Montgomery for a day, and then we go to Selma. But on this trip to Montgomery, We stop at First Baptist Church. It's the church that was pastored by Reverend Ralph Abernathy. And it's the same church where I met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the spring of 1958. Young, white police officer, the chief, came to the church to speak on behalf of the mayor that was not available. And he gave a very moving speech to the audience. The church was full, Black, white, Latino, Asian Americans, members of Congress, staffers, family members, children and grandchildren. And he said what happened in Montgomery 52 years ago during a freedom ride, when you arrived, was not right. He said the police department didn't show up. They allowed an angry mob to come and beat you. And he said, Congressman, I'm sorry. What happened? I want to apologize. This is not the Montgomery that we want Montgomery to be. This is not the police department I want to be the chief on. Before any officers I had, he said, we go through training. They have to know about the life of Rosa Parks, the life of Martin Luther King Jr. They had to visit the historic sites of the movement. They had to know what happened in Birmingham and what happened in Montgomery and what happened in Selma. He said, I want you to forgive us. He said, to show the respect that I have for you and for the movement, I want to take off my badge and give it to you. The church was so quiet. No one said a word. And I stood up to set the badge and I started crying. Everybody in the church started crying. I said, Officer, Chief, I cannot accept your badge. Don't you need it? He said, Congressman Lewis, I can get another one. I want you to have my badge. And I took it. And I'm never ever gonna forget. I'm gonna hold on to it forever. But he hugged me and I hugged him. I cried some more. You had Democrats and Republicans in the church crying. Young deputy assistant, young Black officer was sitting down. He couldn't even stand. He cried so much like a baby, really. It was the first time that a police chief in any city where I visit or where I got arrested during the 60s ever apologized or where I was beaten. It was a moment of grace. It was a moment of reconciliation. And the chief was very young. He wasn't even born 52 years ago, but he was apologizing on behalf of his associates, of his colleagues that have passed. It's a moment of grace. It means that the suffering and the pain that so many people have suffered has been redeemed. And it felt so good and so, at the same time, so freeing and liberating to have this young man come up. He hugged me, he held me, and I felt like, I'm just one. I'm just one of the people. I mean, many people were beaten. It's amazing grace. It's amazing grace. You know that line in there, Amazing Grace. You know that line. Save a wretch like me. And says we all falling short. We all just trying to make it. We all searching. Like Dr. King say, we out to redeem the soul of America, but we first had to redeem ourselves. But this message, this ACA, grace to the badge, says to me, hold on. Never give in. Never give up. Never lose faith. Keep the faith. It's John Lewis, the late John Lewis. Two very different Americans with a similar message. Hang on till the whistle blows, ride till the back of your head hits the dirt, keep the faith. Never lose hope, never lose faith, keep the faith. Most of the Americans that I have met believe in the promise that the country holds, but in different ways. Some people proceed with a belief in the American dream. You can make it if you try. Others have given up on you can make it if you try. The middle class has become a former shadow of itself. You can make it if you try. If you try is a folly. It's become evident in communities that where poverty has prevailed for generations. You can make it if you try is a folly. With Donald Trump's win, pundits talk about the only gap being the certificate gap, not the wealth gap that those who are educated and those who are not try. But resistance is a part of the American promise. Resistance is a demand that the promise be fulfilled. If you give up on that promise completely, of course, you enter into despair. But there's something deeper than the promise at the core of belongingness, which has perhaps been my quest. Where do I belong? There's something deeper at the core. Let's go not so far back for those of you in Britain and Europe. Let's go back to the mid-19th century in America. In 1850, Salmon P. Chase, abolitionist lawyer, defender of runaway slaves, and Abraham Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, eventually Supreme Court Justice, wrote to Frederick Douglass asking about the colonization of Blacks in this way. Salmon Chase. I have no idea what he sounded like. I should be glad to learn your views as to the probable destiny of Afro-American American race in this country. My own opinion has been that the Black and white races would never have been brought together in one community except under the constraint of force, such as that of slavery. I have regarded, therefore, the coexistence of the two races as coerced and therefore not likely or permanent or to endure for much longer than the coercing force, namely slavery. While I have been utterly opposed to any discrimination and legislation against our colored population and have uniformly maintained the equal rights of all men to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I have always looked forward to the separation of the races by the removal of slavery. I have thought that the islands of the West Indies and portions of South America would be peopled from the Black race from the United States, that by them civilization would be carried back to Africa, not under constraints of any colonization system, but of choice and free will. It seems to me that at the present moment, the British West Indies offer a most inviting field for the colored enterprise. Jamaica, with her cheap and fertile soil and delicious climate, is especially attractive. I shall be pleased to know what you think of these matters, which have doubtless attracted your attention. Frederick Douglass responds with a long letter. Here's an excerpt. Frederick Douglass. It is idle, worse than idle, ever to think of our expatriation or removal. To imagine that we shall ever be eradicated is absurd and ridiculous. We can be remodified, changed, and assimilated, but never extinguished. We are here, and that is our country. And the question for the philosophers and statesmen of the land ought to be, what principles should dictate the policy of the action towards us? We shall never die out, nor be driven out, but shall go with these people either as a testimony against them or as an evidence in their favor throughout the generations. Either as a testimony against them or as evidence in their favor. Resistance. But how to find belongingness in a fractious world where inequality prevails? Finding belongingness requires hospitality, and hospitality is a moral matter in part. Immanuel Kant, hospitality, quote, hospitality means the right of a stranger not to be treated as an enemy when he arrives in the land of another. One may refuse to receive him when this can be done without causing his destruction. But so long as he peacefully occupies his place, one may not treat him with hostility. But you can't just manifest hospitality toward yourself. It's not there. You can be a good guest in response to hospitality. So then what do you do about non-belongingness? I want you to see if I can get it to work. I might not be able to get this to work even though we rehearsed it. Okay, I don't think I can get it to work. Okay, wait a minute. No, I don't think I can. I wanted to share with you a painting of, and maybe when we're done, I'll work harder on it, but I don't know. Okay, I am just going to proceed. So there's a wonderful painting that I hope I can figure out how to show you maybe when we are in the midst of our talking with Dr. Shepard Barr. It is a painting by Jack Whitten, who's going to have a big exhibition at the museum. Okay, I think I can do it. Somebody is doing some magic. I think yes, I think you can see it. Okay, so I hope you can see it. Otherwise, I don't know what you're seeing. Okay, so this is a painting, Jack Whitten, African-American painter. The full title is Autopolis for Edouard Glissant. Glissant was a Martinique philosopher and poet and novelist. He was a friend of Fanon, but he took a more poetic route than Fanon. So Whitten explains his interest in Glissant. Glissant's emphasis on an imaginary city constructed out of elements from anywhere, a borderless city built from the uprooted, ungrounded, and nomadic destinies of old and new migrants, a fluid identity. This is what Whitten is celebrating in that painting, which I hope you were able to see. He goes further. Autopolis is a made-up word, a contraction of atopos and polis. It relates to Glissant's longtime commitment to try to articulate a thoroughly interconnected and egalitarian relationship between humans. Autopolis could mean a city located anywhere or nowhere, though in this instance, it refers to what constitutes a city. A polis is a community of persons of various origins. Not topos, place, polis, city. In Greek, atopy, placelessness, unclassifiable, of high originality. Whitten's notion of sense of place, and therefore what it implies about belongingness, makes a lot of sense to me, as did this idea from Glissant. Errantry, therefore, does not proceed from renunciation, nor from frustration regarding a possible, let me go back. Errantry, therefore, does not proceed from renunciation, nor from frustration regarding a supposedly deteriorated, deterritorialized situation of origin. Sometimes, by taking up the problems of the other, it is possible to find oneself. I have been chasing that which is not me. Not to run from myself or even from Baltimore, which I left when I was 21, but to discover something within. After all, it was a trip to Baltimore, sitting at the table with my father, that I was reminded of 3 keys to my search for American character: Shakespeare, a random linguist, and my paternal grandfather. If you say a word often enough, it becomes you. If you say a word often enough, it becomes you. And so the search is really about being in relationship to. Thank you.
Okay, can everyone, I don't know if this is working. I'm trying to start the video. Can everyone hear? Sorry,
I
it's
can
not
hear you,
going
but
on
I
video.
can't see you. I can hear you, but I
Yeah,
can't
it's
see
not,
you.
yeah, I think someone has to have to switch my camera on because I can't get it on. But while that's happening, first of all, thank you. Thank you, Anna. That was absolutely brilliant.
Could you
And
see the
so,
painting? Did you see the painting?
yes, so perfect technically. But I know it's strange because you can't hear the, we have to imagine virtual applause, but it's happening. Thank you. And there will be questions coming in, but I thought I would just launch things a little bit by picking up on one of the things you said, which is actually 2 things. One is the idea that you have mentioned before, intentionally chasing that which is not me. You talk about that, but you've also talked about, when you and I spoke a year ago, we talked about how
A year ago.
there are civic moments. You use the term a civic moment, like the Anita Hill hearings, the Clarence Thomas hearings, in the Anita Hill civic moment there, where there's no place, we have these civic moments, but there's no place to gather and talk, is what you said then. And I wondered if you could put these 2 things together for us, just thinking about that idea, chasing that which is not you, but also trying to find a space for a kind of conversation that we all should be having or are having, but we don't have a unified kind of communal space to have this conversation. I wondered if your theater is doing that, or if that's the aim.
I proposed that yesterday. I didn't actually propose it. I mean, at a panel I was on at a theater, in a theater community, I said, what would it take to do it? I mean, I'm sure maybe somebody, I mean, this is one of those moments in America after the recent election, right? What would it take? And so I don't even know how many people are asking that question. I'm asking that question. What would it take to find that space? How can we gather? Where can we gather? How will we gather? I mean, so I put the question out there yesterday at a theater that has resources. My inbox isn't flooded, but it doesn't mean there's not a conversation somehow. But I put it that way. What would it take right now, right? Because we've all accepted our division. because the election was evidence.
We have a question exactly on that, Anna. This question is from Emma, and she says, to paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr., quote, to redeem the soul of America, we first have to redeem ourselves. And she says, what does this mean in a Trumpian world? How do we keep the faith?
Well, I think what we ask questions like, where can we, and I know that you and I talked about this last year as well, Kirsten, is, you know, how do we build environments where, if we're interested, not everybody's interested. So I should put that out there. I'm not dictating anything. I happen to be interested because for 40 years I've been looking for American character. By the way, this speech is part of the Mellon Lectures that I did this year, whereas 9 years ago, I wrote a speech for the National Endowment for the Humanities, Chasing That Which Is Not Me. And this is Chasing That Which Is Not Me, Chasing That Which Is Me. So my own chase and search has changed. But given my interest in America, not like one kind of America, but all of America, I have my ears open for where those spaces might be. I mean, I'm thinking a lot about, I'll be teaching in the spring. I'm thinking a lot about ways to construct an environment where my students will be more likely to give the benefit of the doubt, and where they will be more likely to be interested. A lot of artists are interested in self because they, for good reason, think the self is the place to begin to make a mark. You know, how can we inch around that? Where's the space, right? So I think it's something that takes a lot of work and a lot of planning and even collaborating with people. So when I said to that theater, you know, what would it take, for example, if you decided to bring people of strong opinions together, and then to ask actors to take on those strong opinions, because as you and I discussed a lot last year, that's also happened to our craft, where people are very afraid to personify ideas that are either unpopular or dark or violent, or they're very afraid of hurting themselves and hurting each other. And there are reasons for that. I can't unpack all those reasons, but I have to accept it as a reality. So I do
That's
think,
interesting.
getting back to
Yeah.
that, the theater and the humanities must be the space if we're going to earn our keep. We must be the space. Art and the humanities must be the space where the division is explored.
Yeah. No, it's incredibly eloquent, actually. And I'm also mindful that not only did we have this public conversation last year where we pursued some of these things, but at the same time, your latest work came out in the Atlantic called The Ghost of Slavery. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit about where that fits and what it is, and would this be kind of illuminating at this moment we're in to mention that?
Well, this Ghost of Slavery is part of the Chasing That Which Is Me. And there are two parts to that. Number one, I've been working for a lot of years. Since 2012, I have been working on looking at what happens to children who have to be in the grip of the government, either because they're in the criminal justice system, incarcerated in some way, or because they're in the child welfare system. And I began to wonder, after making my play Notes from the Field, for which I did 250 interviews in 5 parts of the United States, I began to wonder about where we got this from. And I ended back in Maryland, my home state, for the first time. I mean, I'd been back, but to actually do some work there. And I went to the state archives and I learned that Maryland did not free the slaves until 1864, because it was in this peculiar position of not separating, not seceding, but having slaves and free people. And I found out that in 1864, there was a huge constitutional convention at the end of which the legislators decided to free the slaves, but they also went and got an old law which allowed them to bring slave children back onto the plantations and to keep the girls until they were 18 and the boys until they were 21. It was a form of compensation. They were wondering how they would be compensated for their slaves, which were property being taken away. And this lasted for 3 years in Maryland. And it came down, actually, the case of a little girl named Elizabeth Turner. And so that was going back to my state to grab its history, look at it. And then 2 weekends ago, I had an opportunity. I've just been commissioned to make a play for the semi-quincentennial of America. And I went to Gettysburg, where I met some historians who told me all about my great-great-grandfather, who I really didn't know very much about, except that Skip Gates had referred to him when Henry Louis Gates, did my roots in his Finding Your Roots show. My great-great-grandfather, Basil Biggs, who was a part of the Underground Railroad and who got the contract to gather the men who buried the Union dead. And when I went back to Gettysburg, the house that he rented, the farm that he rented, is still there, of where these runaway slaves hid. I was able to go into the house. It turns out, also nothing to do with my admittance into the house, that the house is actually owned by the father of an incredible Broadway set designer. And then I was able to go to his other 2 homes that are still standing that he owned. And so a part of the search has taken me home, and in particular to the 19th century and what people had to do to try to move forward, let alone repair. That makes sense? Did I answer your question?
Absolutely, yes. And I hope people will find your work. I don't know if you can just explain how they get hold of Ghosts of Slavery.
Oh, I'll send you a copy. But
Okay.
they can get it in the Atlantic magazine. It's only the
In the
second.
Atlantic.
Yeah, that's where they can get it. It's only the
Okay,
second
that's
play
great.
that the Atlantic magazine has published in 167 years. So if they go on the Atlantic play,
Yeah,
they go on the Atlantic magazine website, they can find this Ghost of Slavery.
brilliant. I just really wanted people to know about that if they didn't already. We've got some questions coming in. A lot of them focused, actually, not surprisingly, on America after the election. I'm going to try to bring some of these together. I want to make sure
But
we also
this is
get
so
on
awful
to...
that I'm not there, because I mean, is there a way that people can also say in the chat what they're thinking about it? I mean, I'm so hungry
They are.
to know how
They
this
are.
election played in the world, like what you saw. And also from the outside,
Yeah.
you may be able to say, well, of course, or, well, we were surprised. And, and where are
Yeah.
the seeds for repair?
Well, so we've got several. We've got one that is, I'm just trying to keep up here. One question for you from Jonathan: how can those who are despairing after the election find a sense of belonging in America? And if you hold on to that idea, there's another one from Miles saying, with generational wealth inequality greater than it has ever been, why is class still not a part of American character or US identity? So maybe thinking about those 2 things, despair, how do we not give in to that?
So tell me,
Those of us who didn't agree with the outcome.
the second one,
and also class.
I couldn't understand the second question very well. Do you mind saying it again?
The second one was basically saying generational wealth inequality is greater than it has ever been now. Why is class still not a part of American character or US identity, is the question.
Yeah. Oh, I think class is a part of U.S. identity. I mean, it's not the same as it is in Europe, but people talk about it all the time. They talk about it in different ways. They talk about the wealth gap. I mean, all of the discussion. If we were to go back and look at when did the expression the 1%, when did that arrive? Like the 1%, and now the 1/100th of a percent. People were quite aware of how the wealthy have pulled away from the middle class, right? as well as everybody else leaving behind. So I think that it's all over our conversations, whether it's in talking about that gap, whether it's talking about, as now the pundits are talking about, the certificate gap, like the people who have college educations and those who don't, or those who are not interested in having a college education, or those who feel that the college education didn't deliver what it should have. Or also here, I mean, you know, it's incredible to me that, you know, Oxford remains, you know, probably the best or one of the best universities in the world. And, you know, the level of its esteem is not about how much you pay to go to school, but that's how we estimate value here. You know, I was just at Wesleyan in residence, and undergraduates pay $90,000 a year to go to school. So people are well aware of this class difference. It's just that we speak about it in a different way.
Yeah. Do you think that your work is addressing it as a major factor in the history of your work? Have you consciously addressed class?
I mean, I think it's indicated in the play, for example, about notes from the field about the school to prison pipeline, right? Because I'm addressing the lack of opportunity. That's another way people have been talking about it, the opportunity gap, right? So I'm talking about
Yeah.
kids who can't even get out of school with being incarcerated. So I think is indicated. It's there, right? And also police brutality, right? Because who is more likely to be captured, as one young man told me, snatched by the police? People who are not inside of a home where they're being taken care of. And,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
I think Isabel Wilkerson's book, Cast, also goes to this, and it became a Ava DuVernay film, Origins. So there are, I just think it's discussed all the time without saying it.
Yeah, that's a great way to think of it, actually. Maybe it's not as visible, but it's there. I have another question from Murray. Trump's team is inventing new fantasy American characters, the enemy within, communists, fascists, and basically he is saying, how can we demolish this new round of stereotypes? So kind of thinking about what you said about stereotypes and that idea that we are grappling with new ones all the time. They're in our sort of you know, our just consciousness. And how do we address them? How do we demolish them? I guess is the idea here.
Right. Well, I tried to give a little tiny prescription, which is that, I mean, you can't really, you can get rid of stereotypes on the grand scale by, I don't know, if you're in charge of deciding what shows up in culture or not. But you have to ask yourself. It's a question of the self. I don't really know how to talk about it on the grand scale, but I know that you have to ask, you can ask yourself, why did I go to that, right? And the defeat of stereotypes is particularness. What's particular? I think I see that, but what else is there?
Yeah, and I was thinking about that play that George C. Wolfe did called The Colored Museum,
Right.
like 1984. And I was wondering if, I'm just throwing this out there, but did you I don't know if that's come into your kind of thinking about stereotypes, because it's taking Black stereotypes and actually by a Black writer saying, let's have a laugh about some of these exaggerated roles. And you started your talk with kind of, in a way, gesturing towards some of those.
Well, the ones that I gestured to were not a satire. They were sincerely made
Yes.
by
Yes.
white filmmakers and white writers. I think that's a really good question, because I would say that what George was doing was a form of resistance. That I talked about resistance in this talk, and there are many forms of resistance. Satire is one of them. Joy is one of them. Comedy is one of them, because it causes us to think, well, why that? Why that? Why do we stop at that? So I think, the Colored Museum is probably more than it looks like on the surface in terms of what it causes you to think about things that you've taken for granted.
Yes. And now we have a comment from Edward. There seem very few Americans right now with the time, energy, and curiosity to talk and really listen to others. Anna seems like a modern day Studs Terkel. How in practice can conversations across difference and division really be enabled? Isn't theater, unfortunately, too narrow and too liberal a forum for this?
I think I would stop with too narrow. I mean, theater's too narrow. Yeah, and Studs was a very important part of my life. His book Working was an important part of my life, and he was a friend of mine. And I got a chance to spend a lot of time with him in the 90s in particular. So has a huge influence on me. I just think there are, sort of levels of things we have to get move aside before the theater can really do everything I know it can do and everything it's done. I mean, when I think about the fact I evoked Antozaki Shange and I invoked Adrienne Kennedy, and when I went to acting school, it was my life completely changed and my intellectual inquiry completely changed. But all the playwrights were white, heterosexual, presenting males. You're a scholar of one of them, who would be considered, God when I was in acting school, right? And the well-made play in a way, although you would probably say he wasn't doing that, but he was God. So,
You're talking about Ibsen?
yeah, yeah. But when I think about my generation, we helped change the canon.
Yeah.
I mean, there was no Tony, there was no one like Susan Laurie Parks. Um, on and on and on. Nobody liked that David Henry Wong. So we all came out and did something. Once the tiniest door was open, So all of these people had to find an agent who understood their work, a theater that was willing to do their work, all that stuff. There actually is a lot more opportunity now. And so what are we going to do with that opportunity? So I would say from 1980 until now has been the era of opportunity in American theater. It didn't completely work, and there was a lot of betrayal. I'm not saying it worked, but that's what we talked about. That was the lip service. So the lip service is going to have to change, and I don't know who has the guts to do it. Yesterday at this conference I was at, when I was at a meeting, I said, what would it take? People's jaws dropped open, and like, what would it take? So it's really
the answer,
making a list of what it takes to do it.
Well, the first thing I think of is the Federal Theater Project, of course, 1930s, 5 years. Brief shining moment of an actual, national theater in America. But that got shut down. So it's interesting, isn't it? What would it take?
But what you're saying is, you say, what would it take? We need actors who are willing to say and embody uncomfortable things. We need historians who can tell us what happened in the past. Probably not all from the United States of America, right? Because, we can think of places in the world right now where people are not going to use theater to ease division. But in places where it's worked, like South Africa, I don't mean work, but where the market theater made a difference. So maybe we have to go to places and really have knowledge about what's possible.
Yeah.
So I think it's a fantastic project. And I guess I'm just saying it whenever I'm speaking, even in a modestly public arena, because I would like the theater to be stronger.
Yeah. What a great answer. Thank you. And a quick question from Rex in Portola Valley, California. Is there a record available of a recording of John Lewis's description of the testimony of the police officer in the Montgomery church, he says. And thank you for an uplifting description of what led to your tour in which you captured many different persons. Sorry.
Yeah. In my archive. Yeah, I heard about that when I was working on a project that really started with one of the members of your community, Jane Shaw. when
Mhm.
she was, when Jane was the dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco and commissioned me to make a piece on Grace. And I worked on it a lot in San Francisco, and then I continued to work on it. And I was in a residency at Georgetown working on it, and someone told me that story about John Lewis, and I found a Republican friend. My
Mhm.
friend, the late Amory Houghton, Republican congressman, Corning Glass family, very wealthy friend, man, good friend of mine, good friend of John Lewis. So I called a Republican congressman and said, can you get me to John Lewis? And I was in getting ready to go swimming in a hotel in Washington, had just taken off my clothes, putting on my bathing suit, and my phone rang, and it was John Lewis's aide. And if I could get across town in the next half hour before he left town, I could come talk to him. And I did. And I got that interview. So it'll be in my archive somewhere.
Yeah. And that just is you in a nutshell. You'll go straight over as soon as there's an opportunity to speak to somebody and to get that firsthand testimony. And you can see from the work that that's the part of the richness of all those different voices. Can I ask, we have something from one of my students, Eva, who actually wants to ask you about more technical things, your acting process. She says, I wanted to ask you about the acting process for embodying different characters in your verbatim plays. Do you find that you carry the characters that you have played within you forever, or can you take them on and off?
Boy, I wish I could carry them forever. I mean, that would be like amazing. I don't. I remember, I've spoken John Lewis so much that I remember a lot of that. I remember the cowboy, the bull rider, because I've spoken him so much, but I don't carry it with me like that. I mean, um, that would be amazing, but I think no more than a singer carries a song, right? And I haven't done a whole lot of thinking really about if these things that I have embodied have changed me. I don't know.
Well, can I do a follow-up to Eva's question, which is,
Yeah.
it's a tall ask, but you asked for it by naming your project In Search of an American Character. Because I'm going to ask you, did you find it? Did you find the American character?
No, and that's why when you're 26 years old or 27 years old, you give yourself you title what you're doing as something that's impossible. So you could just keep working on it and thinking that you have something to do.
That's a great answer. And then I have a question here about it's a thank you, really. It's a thank you so much for sharing about this is Richard, who was fascinated to hear about the correspondence between the antebellum judge and Frederick Douglass.
Right. Yeah. That was a very interesting relationship. So this is, we just evoked Amory Houghton, who grew up like a prince. His father had been ambassador to France. His family made Thomas Edison's light bulbs. Talk about social class, right? Amory Houghton. But he and John Lewis were like this. I should have showed the picture. No, they were like this. Amo wouldn't have missed those marches, that going back to Selma marches, for anything, right? Until he probably couldn't move, and his wife, wonderful Priscilla Dewey Houghton, who was a Democrat, a Boston Brahmin. And so, here's Samuel Chase, who was an abolitionist and tried to protect one-race slaves, talk about the particularness, but on the other hand, is talking about exporting blacks to the colonies because we'll never be able to live together, right?
Mm-hmm.
He invites Frederick Douglass to his home in Washington. White people didn't do that. And when Salmon Chase read the oath to Lincoln in his second term, who helps Chase put on that robe in his home in Washington? Frederick Douglass. and Chase's daughter. On the other hand, later on, when Chase's narcissism causes us to do some things that aren't so great, Douglas publishes a shaming letter about him. You know, people said of Sam and Chase, splendid to look upon, but not secure to rely upon. Right. So we can imagine this charismatic man. So just that relationship, and I'm glad that Richard, I don't know if it's Richard Norman or another Richard, picks that up, is part of the salve we need now. Is real discussion. We don't have to agree. And we need nuance. It's not, oh, he's an abolitionist and so he's all good. They disagree.
Yeah. Do you think that we are very much more liable to kind of paint a kind of black and white picture of things, less nuanced? Is that what you're saying?
I think so. And I think this is where education comes in. I mean, how are you experiencing this? You've been teaching a long time too. Do you find that the project of nuance is as easy as it was, say, 10 years ago? Can you say? I mean, and it's about all of us. It's not to accuse our students. It's about all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not students. It's the collective, everybody. And I know people would very often point to things like, you know, the public discourse being conducted on social media. And that is definitely part of the picture, but it's very easy to just point to one thing, isn't it? In the meantime, I have a question from Alice. We have a couple more questions here. One is from Alice, where she says, how does resistance in wartime in France or the Netherlands differ from resistance during peacetime? Can we learn from resistance during the US Civil War?
Wow, what a great question. If you can also find out any information, Dr. Shepard Barr, about who's asking me the question, like if it's a historian or something.
Yes, we're saving the questions for in an archive for you can see.
Okay, so I can know, but it's good if I know who I'm talking to when I answer the question. Well, I think, yes, I mean, my latest project, my latest two projects, both of which deal with the Civil War, deal with resistance. Sam and Chase himself was part of the resistance, right? And he helped get rid of these terrible apprenticeship. But the people that we don't know about, are all of the Black mothers. The parents in 1864 had to go to court to prove that they could take care of their children. These were illiterate people for the most part. They had been enslaved until the day before. And so I know that there's a story, but hard to find out because who's reading and writing and who's writing history of all of those Black parents who walked miles and dug up enough money to get somebody to write a letter to what was called the Freedmen's Bureau, which became a project of the Freedmen's Bureau to try to shut this down, this so-called apprenticeship program. All of those parents going to court. I went to Talbot County and saw some of the dockets. I mean, just the number of people who would be in court on a single day trying to get their children back. So that's a form of resistance that we don't know about. And one of the things, since I'm talking to people who go back to the 12th, the 13th and 12th century, one of the things that becomes so blaringly clear when we look at history, or when I do, and I'm not a historian, is that Sam and Chase kept a diary every single day. And they're transcribed. And you can get them in the library. Thank God Frederick Douglass was transcribed. You can get it in a library. But there are other people, like the lawyers, who were a part of helping bring that down. I can't find anything about them, and they're white men who, one of them went to Amherst. And some of these documents aren't transcribed. You know, Drew Faust, former president of Harvard, wrote a hilarious essay in the Atlantic about how her students at Harvard can't write or read cursive. And all those historic documents are in that. So it's also, you know, a story always about who was evidently there. And so I think a major form of resistance right now for any students who are American or not, maybe just for the, I mean, you know, what's happening in our country is not unique to our country, right? Is keep diaries and keep them in forms that can be really kept, not erased, because that's how we're learned. So this question about the resistance in the Civil War, or, you know, I'd love to talk to that person about the resistance in France and elsewhere.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. And we have Sauce asking a question. Well, first she's saying, thank you so much, Anna. This was inspiring. And I think we all feel like that. She says, do you think we have lost curiosity? That we're content with settled opinion instead of wanting to know and understand more?
650%. So ask us, I know we have to get off. So what I want is her prescription for revitalizing curiosity as a form of resistance. What has she got to say?
Well,
She put it in the chat.
She can't join us. I don't know. Can she join us? But
she could put it in the
don't know.
chat.
Yeah, that was a great way to turn it around, Anna. I think that on that note, we probably do need to draw to a close, and we'll just probably have to leave it to the general audience to think about that one. I'm just reading my instructions here from higher up. If possible, yes, Kirsten, I need to mention an event coming up on December 10th before we say goodbye to Anna, which is Linda Eggert, Ethics, AI, and the Right to a Human Decision. I hope I'm right about that. But that was an important next event happening through this college. And I'm afraid there are a few more questions coming in, but we need to draw it to a close. And the most important thing to do is just to thank Anna for an extraordinary talk. And for me, the special thrill is to hear you embody voices of people you've met. It's incredible to be part of that, to see that, to witness it, and to hear it. So everything was just terrific, and that especially for me. And thank you for answering our questions and for gracing us with your presence.
Thank you. Thank you, Dame Helen and Dave and Kirsten and my friend Jane Shaw, who is the person who has introduced me to Oxford in so many different ways. And I wish you all wonderful holidays and a great Christmas party. And thank you for including me in your community. Thank you, Richard Norman.
Thank you.